Okay, looks like we've got some good numbers. Hi again, everyone, and thanks for joining. On behalf of Encompass, I'd like to welcome you to the webinar today, and I hope you enjoy some of the insights that we're hopefully going to get from Oliver. If you would like to learn more about how Encompass supports regulated firms with UBO discovery and KYC due diligence on demand, then please don't hesitate to get in touch with me directly or via our co-host Themis. Thank you again for joining, and I will pass you over to Henry to begin. Thanks.
Great, thanks so much, Rob. And I'd just like to say thanks very much to Encompass for sponsoring this Themis webinar and giving us the opportunity to talk with Oliver Bullough today. Oliver is a journalist and author with over 20 years experience, both based in the former Soviet Union and traveling around some of the far-flung jurisdictions which double as the world's corporate tax havens today. He's documented much of his experience in a number of books, including the bestseller, Moneyland, Why Thieves and Crooks Now Rule the World and How to Take It Back. No less a person than John le Carre said that every politician and money man on the planet should read it, which I think is high praise indeed. I first encountered Oliver a few years ago when he was working with Russian anti-corruption activists, giving guided tours of oligarchs' houses in London on a bus. And while we were stuck in traffic, we heard eye-popping stories about how deeply corrupt money was embedded in the UK's economy. Oliver and his colleagues spoke of how the MOD had sold a prime London site to a sanctioned Ukrainian oligarch, or how Russia's deputy prime minister had a flat overlooking the Palace of Westminster. Who needs the KGB and its successors when we are prepared to sell ourselves so cheaply for a temporary passing profit? There's a coda to this story. Shortly after the bus tour, I worked for a reputable professional services firm. Over a coffee on my first day, I found out that one of the people through whose windows we'd been eagerly rubbernecking was in fact an esteemed client of my new employer. This points to a truism for many businesses today. You may not want to find dirty money appearing in your accounts, but dirty money is very keen to find you. Thanks to the magic of Zoom, you can also ask Oliver any burning questions you might have on money laundering and how the global financial system is enabling corruption and organized crime throughout the world. We have a 15-minute Q&A planned at the end of this webinar, so please do send in any questions by the questions tab you can see on your screen. And that leaves it all for me to say, Oliver, it's a real privilege to have you here today, and thanks very much for joining us.
Well, thanks very much for inviting me. Happy lunchtime, everyone. I'm really excited to be here.
Fantastic. So you describe in Moneyland a three-step process of money laundering, essentially: obtaining money, often in illegal ways, hiding this money, and then spending it. Today, I wanted to start talking to you mainly about the second step of this process. So maybe a broad question about hiding money. What are the main techniques that criminals use to distance themselves from their dirty money?
Thanks. It's a really interesting question. I've actually, I'm going to backtrack a little bit chronologically to look at why I think maybe we've lost track of how interesting it is that criminals are able to hide money so easily these days. I've just been reading this book, River Kings, about Vikings and about the way they used to, raid monasteries and trade in slaves and so on, and accumulate vast wealth, mainly in silver, which they then buried in holes in the ground. If any of you have been to the British Museum, I've not been there, I've not been anywhere recently, but one of my favorite places in the British Museum was the room upstairs where they have these hoards of Viking wealth just laid out for you to look at, and you can see where all the coins came from. But what's really interesting is that they went to all the trouble to steal this huge amount of wealth from monasteries and whoever, rival warlords, and then all they could do with it was stick it in a hole in the ground, and then they went off to battle and never came back, and the money was lost and only found later by a metal detectorist in a field in Warwickshire or wherever. And so what's really interesting about kleptocracy today, organized financial crime, the real top end of financial crime, is how you don't have to hide your wealth in a hole in the ground anymore. Somehow, at some point, a process emerged that meant that you could steal as much as you wanted and still enjoy the use of the money that you stole. And I think it was that revelation. It seems like a very banal revelation, but it felt very important to me when I had it, because I hadn't really thought about this before. That revelation that really sowed the seeds for why I decided to start writing about corruption. How did it become so easy for criminals and kleptocrats to steal vast fortunes and continue to enjoy the use of them in a way that didn't used to be the case for criminals when money was held in the form of bullion, whether that's gold or silver or jewels, or whatever. And so that's where my trail began. And that was in primarily in Ukraine in sort of 2013, 2014, around the time there was the revolution there. You know, I'd lived in the former Soviet Union for many years and been sort of, had come across corruption on a personal basis, in that people would try and extort money from me or from my friends, regularly, because that's how things are. But I hadn't ever thought about it as a system, and how you transfer, 1,000 rubles here, 2,000, 5,000 rubles extorted from people on the street into a yacht in Holland, or a mansion in London. How, what is the process whereby all of these small street level bribes become vast wealth held legitimately in the international financial system? And so that's the interesting story that I think Moneyland tells. And in a way, the story is sort of my personal attempt to understand how, organized crime became so potent. And I'm not going to tell the story here, but it goes back to the 1950s, and particularly the 1960s in London, when the city of London, in post-imperial city of London, is looking for a new business model, and found this essentially a profitable niche in selling scrutiny avoidance to wealthy citizens and wealthy companies of the world, particularly people who'd put their money in Swiss banks. And in a way, putting your money in a Swiss bank was no more sophisticated than what the Vikings used to do. You just took it to a Swiss bank and they put it in a hole in the ground. You didn't have to dig the hole yourself with a spade. It was dug for you by a Swiss bank. But essentially, you were just putting your money in a hole in the ground. You didn't really get to enjoy it. It was stuck in the hole. And the magic that was created by London bankers in particularly the early 1960s was to create financial instruments, bearer financial instruments, Eurobonds they were called. The Eurobonds today are rather different, but in those days, Eurobonds were bearer, anonymous, tax-free financial instruments that allowed the holders of wealth in a hole in the ground to invest that wealth in such a way that suddenly the wealth broke free. It could be used anywhere, enjoyed anywhere, completely anonymously, carried anywhere in a briefcase. And this was a magical invention. And it had two effects. One was people who had stolen large amounts of money already, the sort of Vikings of the day, whether those were, deposed presidents of South American states, or Nazi war criminals, or just common or garden European tax dodgers, what bankers used to call Belgian dentists, slightly ironically, I think. They were able to make use of the money that they had already stolen or already had slipped past the tax authorities. But it also made it far more profitable and far more attractive to steal in future, because if you stole money, you didn't just get to enjoy the knowledge of the fact you owned it, you also got to enjoy the fact that you owned it. So if you look at the birth of really large scale corruption as it affected particularly sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, Southern Asia, you have this wave throughout the mid to late 1960s and into the 1970s, when governments like the governments of the Philippines, like the governments of Nigeria, corruption becomes a huge problem. It feels almost out of nowhere. There was a Polish academic called Stanislaw Andrewski, who was based at the University of Reading, who created or sort of recoined an old word, kleptocracy, to describe this sudden phenomenon of massive state-scale corruption, grand theft nation, it was been called by an American academic. And really, it was this combination of political power and the ability to hide and then use money. And so that's the moment when, kleptocrats, so corrupt officials stopped just being Vikings, stealing and hiding in a hole in the ground, and became kleptocrats who could steal and continue to enjoy anonymously the use of their stolen money. That's the key moment, and that's when Moneyland was born. And so it's the sort of subsequent development of corruption in the way that offshore sort of spread and infiltrated into so many areas of the world is kind of the story of the book. And I think it's one of the most important stories of our time, the way that responsibility-free wealth has allowed people to buy property, buy political power, buy all sorts of things, by anonymity, without any kind of backlash against them, because the vast majority of people don't even realize it's happening.
Fantastic. Thanks, Oliver. I think that's so fascinating. And we're talking about people buying, but obviously there's a lot of people selling as well. And so that's, you can see the sort of corrupting influence coming from, from this initial theft and then working its way into the financial system of the West. And I think you put it very well that, a lot of these things were designed for tax avoidance, and then the sort of naughty money starts mixing with the very truly dodgy money. I think that's really interesting about the sort of what and what's happening, but I'd be very curious about the how. How does this happen in modern day? And what I understand is, the ultimate beneficial owner of a company is key to understanding who is actually controlling these business transactions. But what we have in the world today is that we have a lot of jurisdictions where you can hide the beneficial owner of a company. So maybe just sort of talking a bit more about your experience. I know you've been to some quite far-flung places where this goes on, but why is it so difficult to identify ultimate beneficial owners? And how does this present a challenge to people who are trying to pinpoint where corrupt theft's been taken to?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing to remember, and I almost had this sort of stuck on a piece of paper on my wall when I still do almost, is that all crime is committed by people, right? The idea that it's committed by a company is absurd. A company is a legal construct. You could no more commit a company could no more commit a crime than a marriage could commit a crime. It's not a thing. It's a legal construct between the regulate affairs between people. So all crime is committed by people. What a company does, or an anonymous company or other structure, whether it's a partnership or a foundation or whatever, is it allows the people committing a crime to pretend that they're not doing it, or allows people who possess stolen wealth to pretend that it's not them who own it, but is instead some other structure. And I came across this for the first time in Ukraine, which was a sort of real road to Damascus place for me, in 2014, when I was visiting one of the fled president's many luxurious residences. He'd fled in a hurry, taken a lot of stuff on a helicopter with him, obviously a lot of banknotes, a lot of works of art and various, but he'd had to leave his houses behind. Obviously he couldn't fit them in the helicopter. And one of them was this rather lovely hunting lodge in a forest about 40 or 50 kilometers outside Kiev. And I visited it in the company of a revolutionary who had, slightly improbably on the day after the revolution, turned up at the gate, told the policeman guarding it that he was the revolution and he wanted the key. And he was so sort of confident that the policeman had just given him the key, and he'd ended up kind of as the custodian of this property on behalf of the nation. We went in there and poked around, and it, unlike a lot of sort of kleptocrats' residences, which I've seen, it was actually rather nice. It was quite tasteful and had all sorts of, like a nice barbecue area. I'd quite happily would have lived there, to be honest. But I suppose the moment came for me when I said to Anton, because this wasn't the first kleptocrat residence we'd been and seen. It was clear that this was just one of very many places that had been built with money stolen from the nation in a very short period of time. And I said, how could you let the president get away with this? How did you not know what was happening? And he was obviously a little bit annoyed because the revolution had literally just overthrown the president. So possibly this was a slightly unnecessary diss on the Ukrainian nation's virility. But he sort of slightly snapped at me and said, we didn't know what was happening. We couldn't have known because, listen, this place where we're standing, the ground we're standing on, he said, this isn't even in Ukraine, this is in England. Look it up. And I did look it up. I was interested to look into the property ownership, and he was right. Obviously it technically wasn't in England, but it was owned by a British company. And that British company was owned by another British company, which in turn was owned by a foundation registered in Liechtenstein. And because of this, there was two things. Partly, it looked like the owner of this land was just a legitimate foreign investor who'd come and invested money in the Ukrainian tourism sector, a British business. And the other thing was, because of the Liechtenstein Foundation, it was completely impossible to figure out who was really behind it. Who was standing behind this investment. All you found was a shell company at 29 Harley Street in West London, and that was it. And I suppose I had this realization that at that point, that corruption is not just a Ukrainian problem, or Ukrainian corruption isn't just a Ukrainian problem, but it is enabled by the West. You have, as it were, sort of demand for corruption services from Ukrainian kleptocrats and supply of corruption services by British lawyers, British company and trust service providers, British banks and so on. This isn't, something that is stuck within one country. It is something that is inherently transnational. And once it becomes transnational, it becomes very hard for anyone whether that's a revolutionary like Anton or a police officer, to figure out what's going on, because you can't, you can't knock down a door in another country. If you're a police officer, it's very hard to obtain evidence from another country. And partly this is one of the places why I think journalists are important. I mean, I would say this, I'm a journalist, but the fact that we can go wherever we like, ask questions of wherever we like, means that in a way we can cut through, the barriers put in the place of investigating offshore wealth in a way that very few officials can. So I was able to follow the sort of traces of stolen Ukrainian money all over the place. I went looking in Cyprus, and I ended up, as you say, I ended up on the island of Nevis in the Caribbean, which is a very lovely place indeed. It's like a very little island in half of the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis, the smaller half and the dodgier half, which is going some because St. Kitts is pretty dodgy as well. But it has a incredibly opaque company registry. And I had this extraordinary conversation with the registrar who I interviewed, and she was just highly amused by the suggestion that there was any corruption involved in what they were doing at all. She just couldn't see why the fact they were selling totally anonymous companies to Ukrainian officials was in any way troubling. She actually laughed in my face when I suggested that they were somehow complicit in the corruption involved. And I think that's essentially the problem, because from the perspective of a Nevisian lawyer or registrar, all they're doing is selling legal instruments. They're not, it's $500 and there you are. Here's your Nevisian shell company. The idea that is a crucial tool for stealing wealth from the Ukrainian nation seems incredibly distant if you're sitting in the Caribbean. And that's the problem. Money flows seamlessly between countries, and suddenly it's half a world away from where it began. And all the people moving it have got no idea where it comes from, or no interest where it comes from. And so that's what I try and do in the book, is to try and piece together this connections between all these places, to show that what you have is a seamless link of corrupt movements of money, which are obscured by Cypriot companies, Nevisian companies, British companies, and to try and cut through all of that nonsense, all of this sort of plumbing in corruption, and just say, where does the money come from? Who was it stolen from? And where did it end up? What's it spent on? And invariably, the people it's stolen from are already very vulnerable people, people who've already got very little, whose lives are being made a misery by corrupt officials, and ending up in the pockets of very wealthy people in major world cities, and particularly London. And this is what we tried to do with the kleptocracy tour that you mentioned at the beginning, was to show that all these beautiful houses, not all of them, but a lot of these beautiful houses, you drive around, Eaton Square or down Brompton Road, these gorgeous West London thoroughfares, and you can point out house after house after house, which is, has been bought with questionable money and obscured behind a shell company, whether that's in Panama or St. Kitts and Nevis or the British Virgin Islands or Liberia or Luxembourg or wherever. And so it's very difficult to figure out what's going on without, good luck or a huge investment of time and resources, which is something where, if you are the victim of corruption, you don't have.
Fascinating. And I think your story about the President's Palace, gives us a real 21st century slant to this corner of a foreign field will remain forever England, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, absolutely. It's a particularly grim example of it, actually, about the way that, almost exactly 100 years after the First World War, how Britain has changed, into this sort of vendor of corruption services to pretty much anyone that requires them. And it's an issue which, we had the review of British foreign policy published, what was it, last week or the week before, which is really interesting because it talks about, organized crime, and it does talk a little bit about corruption, but it talks to them as external threats to the UK. It doesn't talk about the fact that Britain is probably the single leading vendor of corruption solutions, that we are the big center of the enabling industry.
I'd like to jump in here, actually, because you've written extensively about the failures of UK Companies House, for instance, and certainly UK government has got its national economic crime plan. There does seem to be a level in the UK government which understands that there are a number of issues here, but do you think it's just a case of not enough resources, not being awake to the problem, or just too many vested interests, which is causing the UK to be a central cog in this horrific bureaucracy?
Yeah, obviously there is an aspect of there not being enough resources. But I think in a way that's just a way of, that's not an explanation, because that just is another way of saying that there isn't the political will to do something about this. I think that for a long time there wasn't an understanding of what was really happening. I think, us journalists are to blame for that. We hadn't really managed to get the point across of what's really happening. But I mean, for the book I've been working on recently, which I sent the manuscript off a couple of weeks ago, and I'm in the lucky position not yet having heard back from my editor, so I can pretend all is well.
Or from Roman Abramovich.
Yeah, yeah. Let's hope that doesn't happen. But I did look into the interesting story of the Scottish Limited Partnership. Scottish Limited Partnerships, Britain has many weird loopholes and cul-de-sacs in its legislation. The Scottish Limited Partnership is a particularly weird one, in that they were, essentially only really used for agricultural tenancies for decades, and then suddenly, there's this explosion of their use in the early years of this century, and you ended up with more being created every year than had been created over the previous century. And there's a lot of media coverage. A couple of very good, gifted journalists in Scotland who writing for the Herald and the Herald on Sunday about the misuse of SLPs, and a couple of politicians in Scotland who picked up on this and really tried hard to campaign for them to be reformed. And they were being used by criminals, Eastern European criminals. If you look at the Danske Bank money laundering scandal, or any of the big Baltic money laundering scandals, the assets were being held and hidden in Scottish limited partnerships overwhelmingly. And it should have been an easy thing to solve. But if you look at the submissions to government, when government looked into solving this problem, there are multiple law firms writing in and saying that these structures are actually used mainly by the fund management industry, and if greater red tape, in inverted commas, is imposed on them, then the fund management industry will leave and go to Luxembourg. And so, interestingly, what happened was, and this is a story that I don't think has been told before, and I'm quite looking forward to it coming out in my book, the scoop here for you today, is that actually, and this is like really escaped scrutiny altogether, during the process of looking into reforming Scottish limited partnerships to deregulate, to re-regulate them, to up-regulate them, the government actually created a whole new form of limited partnership, which was even less regulated. So while you had the Home Office was fighting quite hard to increase the regulations in order to make it harder for money launderers, the Treasury produced a private fund limited partnership, to which there is also a Scottish private fund limited partnership, which is even less regulated, to make it easier for the fund management industry. So there is this constant push and pull between, what I call in Moneyland, which you mentioned earlier, between the naughty money and the evil money. That the naughty money quite likes these instruments as well, and the evil money gets to slipstream in behind. So essentially, despite the fact that Scottish limited partnerships were almost entirely responsible for the looting of Moldova, to a tune of 1/8 of its GDP, which is an incredible amount of money in a single year. Nothing has happened, really. Nothing substantive has happened to prevent them being used in that way again. Danske Bank, the biggest money laundering scandal in history, largely or primarily using Scottish limited partnerships and limited liability partnerships and various other British structures. Again, nothing has happened, no response to that at all. And I think that shows the extent to which the legislative process, the regulatory process, is being dominated by the interests of the private fund industry, to the detriment of the interests of the citizens of Eastern Europe or other countries where money launderers are, preying on ordinary people.
I think I think that's often something which gets quite lost in this debate, is, as you say, almost a bit like the companies and the fact there's always a person. Really, it's not a company, it's just a vehicle. I think when we talk about money laundering, sometimes the sums are so vast. You talked about 1/8 of Moldova's GDP. I mean, could you give any sort of real life personal examples of the damage this corruption causes, and the way how funds being taken out of Ukraine, for instance? What's the physical effect of this corruption on the people who are most affected by it?
Well, I work with an anti-corruption group in Ukraine called the Anti-Corruption Action Center, which is set up by two insanely brave Ukrainians called Daria Kaleniuk and Vitaly Shabunin, who are lawyers and who wanted to use their legal skills to try and fight corruption in the pre-revolutionary years, and to continue to do so now. And one of the first reports they did, which was in 2013, when it was, it was very dangerous. In fact, Dario had to leave the country for a bit because it was so dangerous, was they looked into HIV, AIDS drugs and tuberculosis drug prices. Just looking at the numbers, just saying we don't know, we can't tell because of the shell companies, we can't tell who's dominating the market, but just looking at the numbers, how much is the Ukrainian government spending on HIV, AIDS drugs and TB drugs compared to what these drugs are available for in other countries? And on average, they were being overcharged between 150 and 300% for these drugs. Now, at the time, Ukraine had the world's fastest growing HIV epidemic. Tuberculosis was widespread in the country's prisons and in particularly in the east of the country. These were huge public health emergencies. In fact, in certain bits of the country, tuberculosis and HIV had melded into a single epidemic, that people with HIV were catching TB because of their weakened immune systems. And this is, it was a desperate situation. And yet, at the same time, there were officials in the Ministry of Health who were colluding with corrupt insiders in pharmaceutical companies to move the shipments essentially via ownership of Cypriot shell companies, which were then tripling the prices in order to take the money. So there just wasn't enough money in the system to buy the drugs the country needed. And no, I mean, this first report by Dario and Vitaly was just into HIV, AIDS, and TB drugs. Later, I looked into this in terms of other drugs. And a particularly striking, terrible story, to be honest, was about the clotting factor, which is used by haemophiliacs. Haemophilia, though it used to be a death sentence 100 years ago, it's very easily treatable now with regular injections of clotting factor, and it means the blood clots entirely normally. But if you lack clotting factor, a bruise or a cut can be life-threatening. It can be the end of your life. And I became quite friendly with a family in Kiev. Nina was the mother, and her daughter was called Nonna, and Nonna was 7 when I first met them. And fantastic, lively, bouncy 7-year-old, just the most funny, glorious young girl. And her mum was amazing, because essentially when Nonna was 1, she was diagnosed as having haemophilia, and she couldn't get clotting factor, even though there is a Ukrainian constitutional provision that all Ukrainians have the right to the healthcare they need. This clotting factor just didn't exist because the money was being stolen by insiders in the Ministry of Health. So essentially her daughter's haemophilia had taken over Nina's life altogether. She could never drink because she never knew when she was going to have to drive her daughter to hospital. She used to sleep next to her daughter and trained herself to recognize the smell of blood. So if her daughter had a bleed when she was asleep, she would know that she could rely on the fact that she would wake up and would be able to wake up. You can imagine that, jumping out of sleep in the middle of the night, putting your daughter in the car, driving her to hospital and hoping that someone has got some of this medicine. And that, I don't know, I found that just absolutely spellbinding. The thought that I mean, I have a 7-year-old myself, and the thought that would be your experience of growing up with a 7-year-old would be just desperation. They couldn't go outside to play because you never know if they'd cut themselves. And that's this is the human cost of corruption. And meanwhile, we have Ukrainian government officials buying 10, 20, 30 million pound houses in West London with that money, with the same money, and I suppose it's quite entertaining when British government ministers talk about fighting corruption. The response of everyone I know in Ukraine is just to laugh. It's like, it's just words. They're not actually doing anything, and it is, and it does. I think it really clashes with the self-image that many British people have of our country. We think of ourselves as a sort of rule of law jurisdiction, and as a sort of, we're kind of one of the good guys. We're very generous with foreign aid, or traditionally, not so much this year. And yet, actually, the reality of it is that our position in the world, from the perspective of most residents of places like Ukraine or Nigeria or Angola, is the place that sells their rulers the wealth management tools that they need to manage the wealth that they've stolen, and that's not great, really. Not
well,
great.
I think that's what I wanted to talk to you about. I mean, I think some particularly horrific examples you've given there, and I think this brings us to another word. You talked about kleptocracy, but one of the other words that seems to go hand in hand with that is enablers and professional enablers. And when we're talking about that, we're talking about lawyers, accountants, trust providers, and lobbyists. Many of these are based in London and in the UK. And what can be done in terms of being able to crack down on this? And is it a case of educating people not to take this money? I mean, the amount of people I've spoken to who laugh about having a Ukrainian oligarch on their books. And then, and actually the reality is this is where the money comes from. What can we do about this?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. There was a case exposed in the Panama Papers of a lawyer in London who had created a couple of companies for the daughters of the president of Azerbaijan, and he as a result of the leak, the Panama Papers leak, and the media reporting around it, he ended up in front of the solicitors tribunal, the solicitors, the SRA's disciplinary tribunal, and was fined quite a substantial chunk of money, though I suppose he probably did quite well for himself, so maybe it didn't mean much to him. Would have been a lot for me. And what I found interesting was his defense. Was he said he didn't even Google these two women to see who they were, but there was nothing about them to suggest that they had any political connections. That was in his defense. They shared a surname with the president of Azerbaijan, right? Now, okay, Aliyev is a relatively common surname in the former Soviet Union, but still, if anything is to give someone away as a politically exposed person, the fact that they have a surname which is the same as the president of an oil-rich, authoritarian ex-Soviet republic, you'd think that would be a bit of a red flag. And I think it just goes to show how normalized it's become for lawyers and others to work with people like this in London, and not just London. I mean, lots of places in the United States and elsewhere in Europe are as bad, if not quite as successful at it as we are. Then I think it's just become normal. You don't, like you say, people boast about it. It's there's a lot of money involved. I tell the story in Moneyland of this astonishing episode of the reality TV show Say Yes to the Dress, in which a wedding dress boutique in New York basically shuts for the day to allow an Angolan government minister's daughter to go and spend six-figure sum on a wedding dress. And it's great telly. It's very entertaining. They're talking about how she's basically a princess in her own country, and they need to treat her, with all respect and everything. And no one at all stops to think Angola is a country with, 55%, child poverty level. I mean, appallingly, deprived population. And how on earth has this woman got enough money to drop a six-figure sum on a wedding dress? Considering her dad is a member of the Politburo. I'm not accusing the guy of corruption. Maybe he has a successful business empire on the side. Who knows? But it's just that the lack of curiosity about the origin of people's wealth. I think that what we need is people to go to jail. I think if one or two lawyers went to jail and got treated in the way that benefit fraudsters get treated, then it would focus people's minds quite significantly. At the moment, there's very few downsides really to moving criminal money around in this country. I mean, we see in the States people get treated, quite roughly. Financial institutions end up with these huge fines, but in Britain, it's a slap on the wrist, if that, most of the time. And so, I think we have pretty good laws in Britain. I just don't think we enforce them, and that's is a chronic problem which has been going on for a long time, and that again comes back to the question of political will. The under-resourcing of the National Crime Agency, the City of London Police, the Met, and Serious Fraud Office is chronic and has been going on for decades. The predecessors of those agencies.
Okay. Just a word now for our audience. So Oliver's going to be taking questions from the audience now in 5 minutes. So please do. We've got a couple coming in, but please do keep on sending them in, and we'll try and get through as many of them as possible in the last 20 minutes of this webinar. I think probably just to sort of finish off on this section, Oliver, you're talking, about investigating some pretty nasty people, and traveling to some quite interesting destinations. I mean, were you ever in danger doing your research, and have you got some pretty fruity stories about going around doing this?
No, I mean, not really. I used to be, before I did this, before I was a journalist, but I used to report on Chechnya in the early 2000s when there was war in Chechnya and an awful lot of hostage taking and suicide bombing and stuff. That was my job. So to be honest, it seems like it's like a retirement job in that regard. You know, that was pretty horrible a lot of the time. And going to the Caribbean and failing to get answers from an official in the Caribbean is, you know, I mean, it hardly feels like working most of the time. You know, oh look, here I am on a ferry from St. Kitts to Nevis, where I'm going to fail to get any information at all while going in the evening to write up my notes in a beach bar. You know, there are worse ways to earn a living. You know, I have had, you know, I do get occasional sort of slightly mean communications, and I do get hacked every now and then and so on. But really, you know, I think the difficulties I face compared to the difficulties faced by investigative journalists in places like Russia or Ukraine or Angola is nothing really. You know, the real people who suffer the brunt of the kleptocrats are colleagues in Azerbaijan, Russia, Afghanistan. Yeah, that's where the danger is. So far on my hillside outside Hay-on-Wye, where I live, you know, I feel okay. I mean, touch wood, no one's come for me here yet. And to be honest, I'd be surprised if they did. I think by the standards of the people they really care about, I'm a bit of an irritation rather than an existential threat.
Fantastic. Well, I think that's a pretty good note to finish on there. Yeah, just to say, you know, some of the articles which I've certainly come across, such as your report on the 2,000 different companies at 29 Harley Street.
29 Harley Street. Interestingly, 29 Harley Street. There was their email server. So 29 Harley Street is the house in West London where Yanukovych had his companies, and I thought it was funny that it was Harley Street. This was when I was very green and looking into all this. Oh, Harley Street, that's funny. And then I looked into Harley Street and realized that for decades there'd just been fraud after fraud after fraud linked back to this one building. And then so I reported this article and nothing changed because nothing ever does. But then a couple of years later, their email server got leaked, so I could look at their email server. And a journalist let me have a look at it, and I could see what they'd been saying about me afterwards. And you know, and they genuinely couldn't understand what I was talking about. You know, I'd put together, you know, I had a huge list of potential frauds I could have chosen to write about, but I just picked the kind of 5 or 6 most extraordinary ones, which were extraordinary. I mean, like 100 million euros, you know, from a Dutch shipping company, you know, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars from American investors, you know, obviously the Ukrainian president. I mean, like a lot of big frauds of all kinds and all shapes and sizes. And they just were furious with me. They couldn't understand why I was writing about them. You know, this guy's, you know, he's got the wrong end of the stick. He's like, we've not done anything wrong. You know, and I think it was that just their failure to understand that they were part of a system that was, you know, perpetuating financial crime to a huge extent, you know, and yeah, I mean, I think it was, I mean, you know, they were selling companies with a director who was dead. You know, she was still signing off the accounts despite the fact she was dead. And yet they were like, oh, well, it could happen to anyone. Well, no, it couldn't. How could you not realize the director of your company is dead? It's extraordinary. You know, she's not available to sign the accounts anymore, and yet mysteriously there she is. So it was a lot of that kind of thing. And it's that, I think people just get on with their jobs and don't realize the effect of what they're doing. People just don't think, you know.
That sounds a bit like a board meeting with Jeremy Bentham. It'd be quite entertaining. Thanks very much, Oliver. I think we're getting some really great questions coming in. And I think, you know, this one's sorry, you haven't put your name, but you talk about how criminals have taken up the uses of Scottish limited partnerships as a tool to hide their wealth. What are some of the next criminal techniques or threats that you think will emerge in the coming months or years? You know, certainly I think from my side, I think about crypto and, you know, how you could just take something on a USB, but I don't want to direct your answer to that. So feel free to go for it.
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. There is a sort of movement, a very gradual, in the great arm wrestle towards transparency. We've seen, you know, the new legislation in the United States, which has been the real outlier on transparency for a long time, you know, inching forward in the EU, suggestions that the UK could improve its company registry so it verifies information. You know, obviously the UK forcing its tax havens to publish, you know, their company registry. So there is a suggestion that we're moving forward on transparency. And And, and this could, could is doing a lot of work, but it could create a kind of new paradigm whereby, it is now normal to publish beneficial ownership. And if you don't, then you're inherently dodgy. So then what happens? It's actually a really interesting question, because it raises the question that it could separate out the naughty money from the evil money. The naughty money could just say, well, it's not that big a deal if we publish beneficial ownership. Whereas for the evil money, it is a big deal. So it could be a game changer. However, as you say, there are lots of potential techniques to be used to allow people to hide money. One of the really interesting things that I'm looking at the moment, and I don't really know how I'm going to write about this, but I want to write about this, is the phenomenon of cash. Right now, I know cash is like a bit of an old school way of laundering money, but it's really amazing how in the last sort of 10, 15 years, the volume of cash transactions has dropped by about 80%, right? People just use cards now. And particularly this last year of the pandemic, it's really quite unusual now for people to use cash. Yet the volume of cash in circulation in all major economies, so whether that's the Eurozone, the UK, the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the volume of cash in circulation is tripled. So while there has been this increasing crackdown on the movement of electronic money, and much more due diligence on the movement of electronic money, at the same time, governments are issuing ever larger volumes of cash to allow criminals to circumvent those controls. And I find that very interesting. There's a distinct lack of joined up thinking in, the government is taking away with one hand while handing out with the other. So I think that criminals are not yet at the stage that they're going to have to rely, or kleptocrats are not yet at the stage that they're going to have to rely wholly on crypto assets. I'd say cryptocurrencies are currently way too volatile to be of much use to anyone with a lot of money involved. I think they're very useful for sort of the drug dealers on the sort of retail level, but when you're talking about billions, I think it'd be a fool who put a billion or two into that kind of asset personally. But I find the use of fine art in being held in free ports and then as a collateral for raising loans, or yachts, big, I was talking to someone the other day who said he had a client who didn't bother with cash anymore. He just has $50,000 watches, turns up in a new city, sells his watch, and there he goes. He's fine. So there are still many ways of circumventing controls, before we have to worry about, crypto. Crypto is a concern, but I think there are lots of other techniques that are of more significance at the moment. Might just be because I'm a Luddite, I don't know.
Well, I think maybe this might bring us on to then back to the sort of the companies area. So obviously a lot of these places, like we talked about, I'm not sure if Nevis is actually, but a lot of these places are UK overseas territories.
Yeah, Nevis is Commonwealth, but not.
But I guess places like the BVI and the Caymans. And so do you think the UK has to make a stand against these financial, and sorry, this is a question from Viri Chauhan, who's from Themis. Do you think the UK has to make a stand against financial secrecy and illicit financial flows? Because surely we're complicit.
No, and we are the big problem, is the UK. Absolutely, the UK should do more. I mean, there used to be, when David Cameron was Prime Minister, whatever that was, 1912 or whenever that was, that felt, he seemed to find this issue something he was interested in. And there were a number of initiatives which came out of the Cameron government which were quite valuable, like having a register of offshore ownership of UK property and trying to encourage more transparency in the overseas territories and so on. But I don't think Boris Johnson cares, to put it mildly. I don't think he's interested in this as an issue. Theresa May, I don't think she was that bothered by it either. So I think a lot depends from the tone at the top. And at the moment, I don't think there's much emphasis on this. I certainly in the sort of the foreign policy review, the integrated review, I didn't see any real sign of a joined up UK response to the problem of illicit financial flows. I'm a little bit more heartened by the Labour side. Annalise Dodds, the Shadow Chancellor, is very good on this. So maybe if we get a change of government one day, then she'd be a bit better if she's still in that job. But I think in general, there is a failure in London to recognise the damage that the UK does. And we need if global Britain, it would be great if global Britain could mean, not Singapore on Thames, but a new paradigm with gold plating all our regulations and so on. But we have, it's another thing I write about in this new book I've been working on. The extent to which our law enforcement agencies are underfunded, I think, is very poorly recognised. the latest, the unexplained wealth order failure against Darigha Nazarbayeva, the daughter of the president of Kazakhstan, former president of Kazakhstan, last summer, that failure will probably have cost the National Crime Agency its entire budget for unexplained wealth orders for a decade.
Wow.
And so that's a major failure. That's not, that's this tool which was talked up by government ministers as the silver bullet to really cut through the kleptocracy links to the UK. That tool is now gone, really, and that's pretty dispiriting, really. And I think if we're going to run a major international financial center, we need to resource it appropriately and not just resource it as if we were an ordinary European country.
Well, I guess maybe then on a sort of slightly more sort of positive note, I mean, certainly working in the sort of financial service industry, the requirements now to do KYC, know your client, and anti-money laundering checks, they're not onerous, but they are part of what everyone has to do, and that's mandated by the FATF, and it recently did its evaluation of the UK. So have all the KYC and this question's from Roger Johnston. Have all the KYC and AML requirements of recent years not made any difference?
It's really interesting. You're absolutely right. I was talking to the head of one of these new AI enabled KYC type companies that really tries to crawl through customer accounts and so on yesterday about the new tools that are available to really help to try and get a step ahead of the money launderers. And it's amazing what the sort of new regtech companies are coming up with to help the compliance departments of banks and other money moving organizations. It's extraordinary what is now available, and it's fantastic. And obviously they are producing reports, and to large numbers of reports which are going to help law enforcement agencies, except that while they've got this amazing 21st century tech combing through their customer records, when those reports end up at the National Crime Agency, they end up in a database that was designed in the early 2000s for 30,000 reports a year and is now getting 500,000 reports a year. So there's been this requirement for the private sector to spend huge amounts of money on compliance every year, while the government has not given anything like those kind of resources to the law enforcement agencies that are supposed to do something with the information being created. You can't expect a bank to prosecute people. I mean, what are they going to start a private prosecution against one of their clients? I mean, it's obviously not going to happen. They create the evidence which they give to the National Crime Agency or the Met or the City Police or whatever, and they're supposed to do something with the information. But they are being inundated with this stream of reports and don't have the resources to do anything about them. So no, I think sadly, the KYC and AML requirements have made it more difficult for criminals to onboard. But once you've onboarded, they don't seem to stop the volume of money being moved around. I haven't seen any suggestion that the amount of money being laundered around the world or the volume of illicit financial flows is in any way contracted. So it's they will have made a difference. I hope they've maybe managed to limit the increase in illicit financial flows, but in terms of reducing it, no, I don't think so. I was talking to a professor of an expert in criminology the other day who was saying that if you want to look at what happens when a government wants to change something, just look at what happened with road traffic deaths from the 1980s when they made seatbelt wearing compulsory. The amount of deaths on the road collapsed. I mean, they're essentially statistically insignificant now. There were loads of them in the early 80s. It was around the same time that government started supposedly taking money laundering seriously, and yet the volume of money being laundered since the 1980s has, I mean, how many times higher is it? Tripled, quadrupled? Who knows? I mean, it certainly hasn't in any way gone down. And I think that just shows that the government doesn't really take this, or governments don't really take this seriously. I think FATF is part of that problem. They're very good at looking at the throughput of information, very bad at looking at outcomes. We don't stop money, we don't confiscate money, we don't prosecute people. We're just very good at filing SARs, and that's not the same thing.
Well, I think actually, again, then this is this question from Tom Stanley, who clearly works doing these kind of checks. Hi, that was fascinating. Thank you. Looking on UK's Companies House the other day, I found a couple of companies that had no appropriate person listed as the shareholder PSC. Do you think the introduction of a person of significant control on UK Companies House has done more harm than good? And can you think of a workable solution if it not?
I think that the PSC regime, like all the controls on Companies House, has imposed extra costs on people who were already obeying the rules, while making zero difference to the difference of people who weren't. These, I mean, it's all voluntary, right? All this disclosure on Companies House, you can just make something up, or like you say, no appropriate person, or we could not unable to find the person certificate control, which is my particular favorite. The fact that a company is unable to know who owns it is particularly charming. I quite like looking at Companies House and just typing in random letters and seeing how many names come up. If you type in XXX on Companies House, you come up with a surprising number of people whose first name or second name, or indeed both, is XXX. You can do it with XYY, XZZ. There are just all these people with crazy names who just don't obviously exist. I think there's an XXX Stalin, who's my favorite. This is an issue with, Companies House and the fact that it doesn't have the power to check the information provided to it, which is again an issue of political will. In terms of a workable solution, there are two workable solutions which would be pretty easy. One of them would be to give Companies House the money it needs to check the information, which wouldn't be difficult. I mean, if you can tell XXX isn't a real name, so just sort that out. Or the other one is to do what they do in the British Virgin Islands and say that you can't register a company directly with Companies House. You need to go via a regulated professional, and then if there's a problem with the information, then you can go after the regulated professional who filed it. I don't see why in Britain we have this fetish with having to be able to create companies directly at Companies House. I created one myself. It took me 15 minutes and cost me £12. The idea that if it costs more than £12 to create a company, this is going to, torpedo the British economy. We were fine with Brexit torpedoing the British economy for the sake of sovereignty. So why can't we accept that we could charge £30 for a company, in order to try and end financial crime? It just seems extraordinary, considering the cost of financial crime to everyone in Britain. So I'd say, to my mind, the best solution would be not to try and turn Companies House into an investigatory agency, which isn't what it's set up to do. It's a library. But instead to have the only people who can file information with it are people who are regulated for money laundering purposes, with their whatever their regulatory body is, and whether that's solicitors or whoever, and leave it at that. And if there's a problem with the information, if a solicitor creates a company and the PSC is XXX Stalin, then you know who to prosecute for that, and soon enough those filings will stop. It seems obvious to me, and I don't really know why this isn't being discussed.
No, it does sound like a very, very neat solution. This might bring us actually naturally to Roy Reevy's question, which is, given the vast amounts of wealth we're turning a blind eye to in the UK and all the upper middle class jobs it's providing, is there any sense that this might be a sort of shadow government policy turning the UK into moneyland, given how important it seems to be for our professional services economy?
Well, it's a really, really interesting question. And actually, in fact, this next book I'm doing, I was essentially, in a way, trying to answer it, to look back and say, who did this? Who was the official in Britain who decided that this was a good idea? And actually, the more you look at sort of government in inverted commas, the more it sort of splinters as a concept. And actually, the sort of the first iteration of offshore in Britain appears a year or two before the Suez Crisis in the 1950s. And it was essentially a way of avoiding exchange controls, which at the time were put in place to support the pound. And it was signed off by the Bank of England. So the Treasury didn't know this was happening. They didn't know for years. But the Bank of England were fine with it because they thought it would bring business to the city. So in a way, was there a government in inverted commas policy to support Moneyland? Yes, there was, if you include the Bank of England in government. The Bank of England was fine with it. It was in the early days, essentially some bits of government, initially the Bank of England, and then subsequently the Treasury, were happy with anything that brought business to the UK. There might be bits of the Foreign Office didn't agree with it, but then in other ways, the Foreign Office, if it was bringing business to the Cayman Islands or the British Virgin Islands, so that we didn't have to pay to support them anymore, we were kind of fine with that as well. I think it's a question of some bits of government supporting the development of offshore just to get themselves off the hook of having to pay to support, something, raised tax revenue or raised, fee revenue or whatever. And I think that's the issue, that we haven't stepped back and looked at this as a whole and said, are we essentially selling criminals the rope with which they'll hang us? We're worrying only about one side of the budget and not the other side. I think that that's been a long-term problem in the UK and possibly in other places. I mean, I think the Netherlands has had a similar issue with their overseas territories as well. And possibly in the US as well, if you look at what happens in Delaware and South Dakota and so on. So yeah, I mean, I think that Britain has for a long time failed to analyse what's really happening or failed to care what's really happening. And yeah, undeniably, an issue is the fact that a lot of people are able to go and work in the city and earn loads and loads of money, essentially by moving funny money around, and that helps, the children of the well-connected and the well-educated to live prosperous lives, and we don't really think about at what cost that's happening.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Oliver. I think we've covered a hell of a lot of ground there, and I see we've got quite a lot more questions to go through. But what we do have is we have the Themis Senate, which is where you can submit your answers written, and then we've got the websites up there now, which you can all see. So if you log into www.crime.financial/Themis Senate, you can submit these questions, and we'll try and get Oliver to answer as many of those as possible.
Okay, I'll definitely answer Rob's question about Elvis. That's
yes. I was about to start. That was my sign off. Actually, I think there might be a few more other people quite curious about what's Elvis doing in the back of the room.
Well, I'm slightly embarrassed to admit this, but when I was growing up, I used to have a bit of a weird thing about Elvis. And I blame there was a matchbox that once said that Elvis died in the month I was born. And I grew up on a farm in mid Wales. I didn't know anything about Elvis really, but I was interested by the fact that he'd died in the month I was born. And I started as a quite a small child to sort of slightly think that maybe I was Elvis, kind of reincarnated, not in a sort of, I can't sing, but just in a sort of somehow. And so I've always had a bit of a strange thing about Elvis, and that was a present from my brother, who decided that I needed to remind myself I wasn't in fact Elvis by having Elvis present with me at all times. So there he is in the corner, keeping an eye on me.
Fantastic. Well, I think that seems to be a good note to end on. The King lives. Can I just say thanks again to Rob for your introduction and to Encompass for sponsoring this webinar. I think we've all had some really interesting times, and please do catch up on the Themis Senate, because obviously this is a conversation we really want to keep on going, and hopefully do our bit to sort of help end this sort of global problem of money laundering. So thanks very much for tuning in, and enjoy the rest of your Thursdays. Thank you, and thanks, Oliver.
Thank you.